Clearances are British history, and they have a long, long duration, not just in Scotland, but in Ireland and England as well, with the enclosures. And the basic mechanism is clearing people out of the landscape where they're self-sufficient. And the Norman squires didn't really appreciate that very much after the peasants revolted in England, looking for more money, and replacing them by sheep. The reason for doing that is because sheep have wool on them. Sometimes they say, oh, they did that because the Napoleonic Wars were on, and this was to get mutton to feed the troops. It's complete nonsense.
Well, did wool have a lot of value then?
What we forget nowadays is they didn't have man-made fibres for a large part of history. So if you could get a large space of land, which is good grazing, and put thousands of sheep out there, and the monks did that in the Middle Ages in the north of England, vast monasteries, and they produced beer on an industrial scale, but also parchment to write on, and wool from the sheep. And all the biggest and most wealthy merchants in history were wool merchants.
Didn't know that. I always
So
thought it was really
it's all to do with the basic commodity, which, yes, they had flax for making linen, but silk was very expensive. In fact, everything else had to come from wool. And the warmest clothing, most hard wearing, was wool. So during the Napoleonic Wars, they needed uniforms for the troops. And the irony of the clearances here is that they were fighting Napoleon at the time, and when they came back, they had been replaced by sheep. And the people who made the money off this were the factors, the middlemen. It's always the middlemen. And the Sutherland clearances are known because the people wrote 2 books about it.
Is that why, I mean, why do the Sutherland clearances stand out over and above the others?
Simply because at that time, when ordinary people out in the countryside didn't have enough education to write a coherent account of what was going on, the people here organised schools, and they were kind of geared towards producing ministers for the church. They were all native Gaelic speakers. They had to do it themselves. They were in a remote part of Britain, but they had a tremendous tradition. And in each of the small settlements that they had, every 2 or 3 miles, there would have been a school. And a trainee minister would teach the children. And if they were bright, they could teach them Latin, and they could teach them Greek, and they would, if they wanted to become masters of divinity, as several of them did, they would teach them Hebrew. This is absolutely staggering, as well as English.
Right. So that's what makes the clearances here stand out, is because people wrote
believe
about
it or not, that is the reason, because the 2 books were written. One was by MacLeod, Gloomy Memories, Donald MacLeod. The other one was a minister's son, Donald Sage, 2 Donalds. They were both native Gaelic speakers. Donald Sage starts his very first paragraph as, my first language was Gaelic, my second was Latin, my third was Greek, and my 4th language was English.
Right.
And he was taught that these by his father, but this was in a little school in Kildonan. His father actually preached here, actually, in his early days. And these people were very, very well educated. Yes, there were people living a very, we would say, primitive life, like they would have done in the Iron Age, but they had the music, they had the songs, and they had the poetry of Rob Down.
Right.
So the reason why the Sutherland clearances are known all over the world is that they wrote these books so well. They're such graphic descriptions. On the wall behind me are quotations taken from the 2 books, which are used over and over and over again. They're brilliant reporting. They're in Victorian English, fluent Victorian English, but they tell the story so well, you couldn't tell it better. And people used to quibble with oh, that wasn't quite historically accurate, or it's very emotional, it's not a considered account. Now they say, no, this is exactly how people feel when something terrible like that happens to them. This has happened throughout the 20th century, for goodness sake. You know, and if you speak to people who suddenly their houses are burned in Vietnam, whatever, and they have to move and they become refugees. Refugees are the story of the 20th century.
So this behind
this is the same story.
This is the story right the way through, and this was reproduced in the school. In the school,
and the school was involved with this museum when it very first opened, and this was one of the things that they did, that children wrote out these versions of quotations from these two books I talked about.
Right.
And the unique thing is that down the west coast, clearances happened. During the potato famine in Ireland, things like that happened, and they happened also in other parts of Britain. But there weren't people with this skill to sit and write it down, and the organisation within their own society to then push it through and have these printed as books.
Right.
It's enormously difficult. You had to get subscriptions, all kinds of things. Well-to-do people put money to actually put a book together was a major undertaking. And so many of them were officers in the army. This is the other side of their culture. And they managed to do it. And MacLeod, who wrote the first book that came out into the general public, wrote letters to the newspapers for 40 years. He never gave up. He had this, to tell the story of his people. And finally it was all put together into the book called Glowing Memories.
And it lives on.
So, otherwise, nobody would have heard of the Sutherland Clearances.